Hey everybody, this is the second of three videos that I'm making on qualitative research methods in media studies, and particularly talking about how we move from the rise of interviewing in the form of life stories and oral histories in qualitative sociology through to doing research on how media are made and how people experience the creation of media and also the reception of media products. In this particular video, I'm going to be talking about how some of the methods that we talked about that grew out of sociology in the early to mid 20th century, based around the value of going off and spending a lot of time talking to the sorts of people that society normally ignores about their life stories and their histories and their daily life. How did that begin to find a place in media research? So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to talk about the motivations that inspired the move of the emergence of qualitative research methods, particularly around oral histories, life histories, and interviewing in media research, and some of the more up-to-date examples where we can see these methods at play and used in ways that really enlighten social conversations about how media work in society. And what I want to draw attention to in that section is the role of feminist research and how studies of particularly young women, how young women use the media, has been really insightful about important questions around pleasure and the commodification of culture. So that's the journey that we're going to take in this video. So let's start off with what inspired the qualitative turn in media research. And I suppose we can say, or I would argue, that the turn toward qualitative data in media research was motivated by largely the same forces that explained that turn in sociology as well. And this was namely the frustration at what methods such as large surveys, large content analyses, and experiments couldn't tell us about the social impact of the media. One thing that you should be aware of is that quantitative methods are very much in the ascendancy as a method in communications and media research as a whole, and that was particularly that was particularly true in the early mid, even toward the end of the 20th century. In media research as a whole, quantitative content analysis, surveys, and experiments very much remained the dominant methods that were used. But one of the interesting things about the history of media research is that very early on, even the researchers who used those methods became quite frustrated about what they weren't finding out. And to me, one of the best embodiments of this tension is Hadley Cantrill's study, The Invasion from Mars. And this was a study on the impact of a radio play that was broadcast in 1938 by Orson Welles, which was a modernization of the H.G. Wells novel War of the Worlds. So, War of the Worlds is about an invasion from Mars, and it's originally set in Victorian England. But Orson Welles had the idea of updating it to present day New Jersey, then present day New Jersey, 1938, and filming it as a radio play that was that purported to be a live news story. And there were many stories at the time that many thousands of listeners who listened to the broadcast thought it was a real invasion from Mars, and kind of did things like pack their cars and try to drive up to the mountains and all these sorts of things. But certainly, the radio station itself was flooded with all kinds of questions saying, "Is this real?" So on and so forth. So Cantrill looked at this as a fantastic opportunity to study the potential that radio had to create some kind of mass effect, in this case, a mass panic. It's kind of interesting because for a long time, radio, actually before radio became a mass medium, people were already concerned about its interested in and concerned about its potential power, and so this was really one of the first manifestations of that power in action. And Cantrell set off to figure out what exactly was going on. And one of the things that he found out very quickly, one of the realizations that he came to, was that you could look at all these sort of banks of, you could go out and count the number of people who panicked and this, that, and the other, but it didn't really tell you very much. Cantrell was much more interested in knowing why people had reacted as they had. And if they had panicked, why had they panicked? What was the reason behind it? So again, the same as we know that if you do a survey and two people can give the same answer to a survey, but they can have completely different reasons for giving that answer. And sometimes you want to know the reasons behind the answer, not the answer itself. And Cantrell was of the same opinion. And so what he did is he went out and sort of found people who had been taken in by the whole thing and said, well, what actually made you think that this was real? And certain things emerged. For example, one of the interviews he did with someone who had believed it was real was with a woman who was incredibly religious, incredibly depressed about the the moral state of the United States at the time, and was absolutely convinced that what she was listening to was God's wrath. So you really couldn't understand that reaction unless you listened to her entire life story about the importance of religion in her life. And this is just one example that I could talk about, but it's an example of how even one of the people who became a real kind of leading pioneer in quantitative methods, Hadley Cantrell, was well aware of the value of sitting down and talking to people about their use of media and how that use fit into their daily lives as a really important part of understanding how media work in society. So this was the early inception of qualitative methods in media research. More recently, I think one of the places where this has become really important is in research on young women in media. Back in 2013, One Direction toured Australia, and I was asked as a media expert, as a popular culture expert, what the scenes of thousands and thousands of teenage, young women, girls arriving at airports and sleeping overnight to greet the latest boy band, what this really meant. And one of the things that really struck me about a lot of the interviews, I've been interviewed by radio stations and TV journalists and broadcast newspaper journalists and all this kind of stuff. And I got really kind of two things really struck me. Firstly, that almost everyone who interviewed me was incredibly dismissive of these girls. So no one would, if it's a bunch of people going crazy at a football match or a rugby match or whatever, people kind of understand that. They think, oh, it's part of this kind of tribal passion, and that's very understandable. But people really didn't take these girls seriously. And the other thing that really struck me after a while was just how angry some people got at them. These silly people. They should really understand when they should be able to behave properly. Why aren't their parents keeping them indoors, and so on and so forth. So I wrote this piece in The Conversation about. And it was based on what we know from an emerging field called girl studies, which was a field that went off and interviewed basically girl fan groups. So, for example, there was research on fans of boy bands and talked to girls about why they felt particularly enthusiastic about particular boy bands in the face of the fact that they're all pretty much the same, to outside eyes at least. And one of the interesting things that's come out of this research is that young women who consume this sort of media are very discerning consumers. They understand the genres that they are fans of very well, but the pleasure that they get from these genres also relates to this very canny perception that the world thinks they're silly and the world treats them with disrespect. And in a very roundabout way, if you spend enough time talking to these women, or the researchers who have spent enough time talking to these women, find out that when girls are interacting with these types of bands, they're very self consciously talking about their place in society and the things that annoy them about the way society treats them. Now, one of the best examples of this, one of my favorite, is taken from this book, Titanic: The Anatomy of a Blockbuster. And this is a series of essays written about the movie Titanic, Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. And one of the articles in here is about online Leonardo DiCaprio fans by Nash and Larty. And again, through looking at the interactions between the girls who are fans of Leonardo DiCaprio and listening to their life stories, listening to their experiences, what the researchers found again was this the way that in talking about why they loved Leonardo DiCaprio and why they loved Titanic, very often the girls would move into a conversation about how they felt about the society around them. So, for example, girls started to have very canny, telling conversations about the commodification of media industries. So one of the things was if one of the dynamics of this particular movie, one of the things that made it so interesting was that it sold itself as a different kind of movie to different kinds of people. So Leonardo DiCaprio was very keen to distance himself from his teenage girl fans and try and sort of sell this as a serious romantic drama. And what Nash and Larty found was that this quite annoyed a lot of his fans. And a lot of his fans were saying things between themselves like, well, we really think he should be more grateful to us because we're the people who pay his wages. We're the people who see the movie thousands of times. We're the people who buy all the fan paraphernalia. We're the people who buy the soundtracks. And frankly, he should be more grateful. And this kind of rather reflects the fact that society doesn't take people like us, young teenage girls, seriously. So, what Nash and Larty found very quickly, simply by it wasn't even talking to teenage girls, it was simply by observing what girls said to each other and how they explained their lives to each other via fan websites, was that to be a fan of Titanic eventually became a way of making sense of your place in the world as a teenage girl, and also coming to consciousness that the world didn't take you very seriously because you were a teenage girl. So it kind of becomes a way of engaging with sexism in a very, very interesting way. So the point is then that in gathering that what we begin to see by the early 21st century is that the qualitative turn in sociology has very much moved into media studies and is seen as being a powerful way of connecting how people use media with where they are sitting, where they see themselves, where they see their social position in terms of global commodified media culture, in this case in relation to gender. So in the next video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on and talk about how students have taken some of these ideas and used them to generate their own innovative projects.